I was doing just fine until you showed up.
At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to a former professional tennis player called Chris, who has now moved to London and become a tennis teacher. While playing tennis, Chris meets Tom, a man who later becomes his best friend because they have a lot in common, so their friendship becomes very close. And one day, Tom invites Chris to go to the opera with his family, and Chris agrees. There, he was introduced to Tom's family, including his sister Chloe. And while watching the opera, Chloe was seen frequently stealing glances at Chris, indicating that she was interested. And then, to make a long story short, Tom told Chris that his family liked him, and eventually Chris and Chloe became closer and even started dating. But at that stage, there was no deeper physical relationship between them. One day, when Chris visits Tom's house, he sees a woman playing table tennis there, and to him she looks very attractive with beautiful blonde hair. Then, of course, Chris is attracted to her. And when Tom introduces the woman, he learns that she is Nola, Tom's fiancée. Tom then tells Chris that his family are not in favor of his relationship with Nola, but Tom goes ahead with the relationship, and on the other hand, Chris starts to go out with Chloe more often, and their relationship becomes more intimate. The next day, while Chris is at Tom's family home, Chloe and her parents are discussing Chris's future, and it seems that they are interested in getting him into Chloe's father's company. So, in the evening of the same day, Chris, Tom, and their respective partners have dinner together, and here we can see that Chris and Nola often look at each other, indicating an attraction between them. To cut a long story short, Chris ends up joining Chloe's father's company, which makes Chloe very happy. And then on another occasion, Tom invites Chris and Chloe to watch a show with him and Nola. But Chloe refuses because she is busy, and because Chris is desperate to meet Nola. He then persuades Chloe to come with him. But when they arrive, Tom turns up to tell him that he cannot come because he is ill. And this causes disappointment on Chris's face as his hopes of meeting Nola are dashed. One fine day, Chris bumped into Nola alone, and, seeing an opportunity, said hello to her. Nola was about to go to an audition and Chris kindly offered to accompany her, even waiting patiently by the side of the road while Nola went through her audition.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Broadcast.
And when it was over, they sat together in a cafe for a casual chat. During the conversation, they confide in each other, and Nola reveals that Tom's family doesn't really like her, unlike Chris, who is actually very well accepted by Chloe's family. And when Chris hears this, he just looks at Nola admiringly, like a person in love. Long story short, while Nola is spending time with Tom's family, Tom's mother makes a subtle reference to Nola's audition failure, and the words are so painful to Nola that she finally decides to leave the place in a state of hurt. And Chris, who is elsewhere, sees Nola walking alone in the rain, and then without hesitation, he immediately approaches Nola and leaves Chloe. In the pouring rain, Chris kisses Nola, and although Nola initially thinks this could end badly, Chris continues to encourage their physical closeness, and an illicit relationship between them then happens in the middle of the field. Over time, Nola begins to distance herself from Chris, and when they meet again, Chris reveals that Nola has grown colder to him, and Nola explains that they cannot continue this relationship because they will become in-laws, as Nola is going to marry Tom while Chris is going to marry Chloe, so it is impossible for them to continue an affair in this situation. And Nola finally decides to end their relationship. During a party at Tom's family, Tom's parents talk about Chris and Chloe's wedding plans, and Chloe's father is very happy that Chris will soon be part of their family. But underneath it all, Chris is actually still thinking about Nola, because every time he sees Nola, his mind keeps getting distracted, especially when he sees Nola and Tom together, and although his heart burns with jealousy, he chooses to keep quiet. Eventually, Chris and Chloe were officially married, and Chloe's family gave them a large and very decent house. One day, while playing tennis with Tom, Tom reveals that he has broken up with Nola, and he says that the main reason is that his mother dislikes Nola and wants Tom to marry an English woman. And of course, this news reawakens Chris's curiosity and interest in Nola. Chris starts looking for Nola, but when he visits her flat, Nola has moved out and her whereabouts are unknown.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Broadcast.
To cut a long story short, Tom ended up marrying another woman. And while attending a family gathering, Chris saw Nola again, so he pretended to go make a phone call, but he actually approached Nola, and they chatted for a while until Chloe arrived. But Chris then quietly begged Nola to give him her number, and although Nola initially refused, she eventually gave Chris her number. After the event, Chris asks Chloe to go home by herself first as he has work to do, but instead of working, Chris visits Nola's house and their illicit relationship resumes. The next day, Chloe discusses her desire to have a child with Chris and even invites Chris to make out with her before going to work. But Chris refuses on the grounds that he will be late for work, when in fact Chris would rather go to Nola's house and have a physical relationship with her again, even to the point of neglecting his work. While he is with Nola, Nola's neighbors then notice their inappropriate relationship. On another day, Chris and Nola meet again, and this time Nola talks about Chris's wife and her desire for their relationship to go beyond lust, and Nola says she wants their relationship to be more serious. While at the same time Chris and his family talk about their holiday plans. One day, Chris gets a call from Nola, and Nola can't resist hinting that she'd like to see Chris soon, so Chris promises he'll come. But because Nola is so impatient at dinner, Chris ends up lying to his family, saying he has to go into town for work, which his family eventually understands, considering Chris's important position in the company. When he meets Nola, she unexpectedly tells him that she is pregnant with his child, and Chris is shocked and confused by the increasingly complicated situation. He felt depressed because he had to deal with several problems in his life, including his job, his marriage, and his affair with Nola. Chris thought about confessing everything to his wife Chloe, but when the conversation got serious, he avoided the subject, perhaps because he wasn't ready to reveal the truth to Chloe.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Rod Carp.
Chris then met Nola again to discuss the matter, but Nola, who had become angry and jealous of Chloe, was disappointed that Chris had not taken responsibility for her pregnancy yet. To cut a long story short, when Chris and his family were gathering together, Nola called him because she wanted to solve the problem immediately. But Chris lied that he was abroad and couldn't come home anytime soon. Then, when Nola went outside, she saw Chris was still in London.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Rod Carp.
And because of the anger and disappointment that she felt, Nola then confronted Chris on the street, and Chris then took Nola in a taxi, and they discussed the matter again at Nola's house, and Nola demanded that Chris take responsibility for the child she was carrying and asked him to be honest with Chloe immediately. The next day, Chris began to plan something. He went to his father-in-law's tool shed and took a shotgun and bullets, which he then put in his tennis bag, and fortunately, his wife did not know what Chris was planning. Chris then called Nola and told her that he had some good news and she was looking forward to what was going to happen. After finishing work, Chris rushed off with his tennis bag, but before going to Nola's house, he first visited Nola's neighbor, who was an old lady. And after talking to her for a while, Chris took advantage of her moment of inattention and attacked her, after which he took some of her valuables, including her ring, and left in a hurry.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Rod Carp.
After completing his business at the old lady's house, Chris hid by the door to await Nola's arrival, and when Nola arrived, Chris immediately attacked her and fled in a panic, and soon after the police and detectives began investigating the case,
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Rod Carp.
assuming that the incident was caused by a robbery. Upon arriving home, Chris's family received the shocking news of this tragic event, which of course leaves them in shock. But in the midst of these terrible events comes the happy news from Chloe that she is now pregnant with Chris's child, and Chris is then called in for questioning by a detective. But before meeting the detective, Chris throws away all the items he stole from the old lady's house, including her ring. Chris then undergoes an interview with the detectives, but the results do not make the detectives suspect that Chris is the perpetrator of the murder. And that night, Chris awakens from sleep after having a nightmare where in his dream he sees Nola and the old lady come to haunt him and warn him that he will get his punishment one day. But it turns out to be a dream of a detective who then shared it with his colleague.
Good morning, Chris Wilton. Rod Carp.
And although the detective felt that Chris was involved in the case, his colleague did not care much because there was already evidence that this was a robbery. Even the old lady's ring was found by someone else. And finally, the case seemed to be closed. To cut a long story short, Chris and Chloe's child is born, bringing happiness to their family. But still, Chris remains conscious of his sins, and he can only stare out of the window, knowing that his mistakes and dark secrets will continue to haunt him, and the film ends.